Welcome back to Hope for Better Times, the Pietist option for Lutherans. This is a 4-part online series for Roseville Lutheran Church in Minnesota. My name is Chris Garrett. I'm a history professor at Bethel University in Arden Hills, Minnesota. So in the first segment of this series, we just talked about why it's important to study history in the midst of crisis, whether it's the COVID-19 pandemic that has us all housebound as I record this in late March 2020, or the kind of longer brewing crisis facing denominations like the ELCA, whose own internal projections suggest it might all but disappear by 2040 to 2050. And so we're going to talk about Pietism, which very famously in the 17th century, in the midst of a real crisis, promises hope for better times. So we'll talk about some of that history in segment 3 and how it connects to the history of Lutheranism, but we have to start with a much more basic question, a question of definition. What is Pietism? So I'll have you ask yourself that question, and if you're anything like most of the audiences I talk to, your answer is most likely, I have no idea. This is not a word that's familiar in the American vernacular in the 21st century, or hardly any time before that. And if you do have some sense of what this means, it might not be a very positive kind of meaning. Pietism, we'll see at the end of this segment, is often a pejorative in Lutheranism and other American Christian traditions. And, if I'm being honest, when I first came to Bethel in 2003 and was told that it was a Baptist Pietist school, I couldn't have told you what Pietism was, even though I had grown up in probably the most pietistic denomination in American Christianity, the Evangelical Covenant Church. I'm sure I'd heard about it in confirmation class at some point. We'll come back to that. But for whatever reason, by the time I got to Bethel, I didn't know what pietist meant, and so my education in this history started by walking across the hall to the office of my friend, colleague, and mentor, G.W. Carlson, professor of history and political science, who died in 2016. And G.W. is kind of the keeper of the Baptist Pietist flame within Bethel and its denomination, which is now called Converge Worldwide. It used to be the Baptist General Conference. And so G.W. kind of got me interested in Pietism, got me reading about it, doing some research about it. And then a couple years after I came to Bethel, we hired a new historical theologian, Christian Collinswin, who is now pastoring Colonial Church over in Edina. Christian is American Baptist pastor, but also a really gifted theologian, and had encountered Pietism through studying Wesleyanism, and also through studying two 19th century German figures, a father and son pastor duo called the Blumhardts, who are influenced by Pietism. And so Christian, GW, and I put our heads together, got a grant from the Lilly Foundation, and in 2009 got Bethel to host an international conference called the Pietist Impulse in Christianity, which drew about 100 scholars from 20 different states, Canada, the UK, Germany. Even my father-in-law, an ELCA pastor from Iowa, made the drive up 35. And it was very helpful, I think, for Bethel, and helped Pietism Studies, which is a pretty flourishing movement in the academy right now. A couple of years after that, we published this book you see pictured on the screen. You can still get this from Whiffenstock, the Christian publishing company in Oregon. It's a little bit academic, and so instead let me recommend a different book that was written in 2015 by Christian and one of our speakers at the Pietist Impulse Conference, Roger Olson. So Roger was a longtime Bethel theology professor and then took up a job at Truett Seminary at Baylor University in Texas. And they wanted to write a book that would be accessible to a general audience that would help reclaim Pietism, take the history and make it meaningful for 21st century Christians. And I highly recommend it. It's better than my own books in terms of a historical introduction to all the things we're talking about in this series. And in the book, they try to distinguish between two ways of thinking about Pietism. First, as a movement, but second, as an ethos. So I'm going to just give a nutshell description of the movement, because that's what we'll come back to in section 3 of this series. We'll spend most of our time today on the ethos. So in the 17th century, in what's now Germany, then the Holy Roman Empire, there is a kind of loose network of Christian individuals who are called, by their critics at least, pietists. So it's meant as an insult, right? They're overly pious. They're holier than thou. And it's mostly Lutheran pastors and scholars, and they start founding educational and philanthropic and publishing and other kinds of institutions in places like Frankfurt and Dresden and Leipzig, and especially Halle and Herrnhut, the center of Moravianism. The cover of this book here is an image of what's called Moravian Pentecost, a revival movement in Herrnhut. And it starts becoming an international movement. Pietists go to Scandinavia and to the Netherlands and to the UK. And as some of the first Protestant missionaries, they go to India, and they go to Labrador, and they go to the Caribbean and to North America. But the movement really doesn't last very long. It suffers after the death of one of its organizational geniuses, a scholar and pastor named August Hermann Francke. And by 1800, it's largely dissipated. You can still find flickers of it. The Blumharts I'd mentioned before are 19th century Württemberg in southwestern Germany. The region of Swabia or Schwaben is kind of a historic center of Pietism. Next year, I'm actually supposed to go to Marburg, Germany to give a talk on Pietism at a small Protestant seminary called Tabor College, which is Pietistic. But it doesn't form a denomination, and most of its institutions fade away. To this day, it's hard to find Pietist churches anywhere. I think there's one in Ohio if you Google it. And so instead, Roger and Christian thought it was more helpful to think about Pietism as an ethos. Here's how Roger explained it. The movement is gone. All movements have their time and die out. Their lasting influence is through their ethos. The Pietist movement was energized by a spiritual ethos that outlived it and can be seen in many sectors of contemporary Christianity. In fact, one of his other books, Roger writes that Pietism as an ethos is really the main form of Protestantism in American history. It just takes different forms, depending whether it's in Lutheran or Baptist or Reformed or Mennonite or other kinds of churches. So what is the ethos? Well, Roger and Christian have their own definition, and you could read their book to get it. Let me try to give you my definition. So in part one, I mentioned that in 2017, I took a shot at writing a more general audience kind of book about Pietism, not even so much a history as a kind of contemporary application book. And my co-author was my friend and former pastor, Mark Patty, senior pastor at Salem Covenant Church up in New Brighton. As we wrote the introduction, we talked about A, whether we should even call it Pietism, because who knows what that is. But B, if we did call it Pietism, how would we define it in a way that would be meaningful to people who don't have any of this history of the movement, haven't heard it before? And we came up with the notion of 4 religious instincts. And so use this as a way to kind of gauge your initial reaction. Before I even get to the history of Pietism, think about these instincts and how they speak to you. It might be none of this resonates with you. I hope you still listen. But I would guess at least a couple, 3 of these do kind of stick with you, because Pietism really is that pervasive in American Christianity, for better and for worse. So let's start where you probably always should start if you're a Christian, with God. Pietists would instinctively say that we know God more through prepositions than propositions. So let's start with the last word. A proposition, an intellectual idea about something. God is sovereign. God is all-powerful. God is just. God is triune. Christ is Lord. Christ is Redeemer, etc., etc. Now, those are really helpful. They help clarify our understanding about first things, about what matters most to us. I'm not a theologian. I'm grateful there are people who think theologically about God. And in some sense, all Christians should think theologically about God. It's why we say the Creed. It helps sum up our belief about Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But Pietists would say if that's all we do, we're reducing God to an idea. God is just a theorem then. God is just a principle, a presupposition. He is an abstraction. But God is a person, a triune person with whom we have a relationship. And so think now of those little words in every language called prepositions. You know, those little things that are useful in Scrabble. In and to, under, over, unto, towards, for. The little words that link nouns together, that link subject to object, that link God to us. So it's always awkward to quote yourself, but I thought this is maybe a paragraph that helps elaborate what I'm talking about. So from the introduction to our book, I wrote, before we attempt to make theological sense of God, and after intellectual certainty gives way to mystery and paradox, we experience life in, with, through, under, and for God. Christians who lose sight of this, who crave the certainty of fixed propositions, risk sliding into what Pietists called dead orthodoxy. So that's a phrase from the movement from the 17th century. Pietists accused the established Lutheran churches of the time of teaching the right things, orthodoxy, right belief, but just as an idea that made no impact on life, that led to no vitality, that left things feeling pretty dead. And whether that's fair or unfair, I think that's really stuck with Pietists down through the years. That it's possible to think too much about God and feel too little a relationship with God. God is ineffable. God is mysterious. And even as we start to get some clarity in that mystery and resolve that paradox, that's not as important as the life we experience in, with, through, under, and for God, especially through Jesus Christ. So get the sense right away that Pietism is a very relational form of Christianity, starting with this vertical relationship to God, but continuing horizontally with our relationship to each other. So here's the second instinct. Pietists trust to a fault that we're better together. This is not a solitary kind of Christianity. This is not something you can do by yourself. You need other people, not just to love God, but to then go out and love your neighbor. And this takes lots of forms. This does mean worship on a Sunday morning, in person hopefully, but maybe even online. But it means other kinds of relationship. One of probably the greatest contributions of the Pietist movement in the 17th century was to popularize the idea of a small group, which John Wesley then took into Methodism and now is pervasive in all forms of Christianity. That maybe we need a more intensive kind of relationship. Martin Luther had talked about this early in the Reformation, but it kind of went away. But even in a small group, with people you know well, you trust, there are differences. We have tensions. We disagree about theology and worship and how best to love our neighbor and politics and society and everything else. And Christians, despite all the New Testament's encouragements, exhortations to unity, Christians split. But Pietists have really made this a priority, that this is not just a platitude that we're better together. We have to try to live together. So you see here a picture of one of my favorite Swedish Pietists, a really important figure from the Covenant Church's history, Paul Petter Waldenström, P.P. Waldenström, who's a Lutheran pastor and also a politician in 19th and early 20th century Sweden. So in a 1904 sermon, he put it this way: "Wherever on earth believers meet together, they feel themselves drawn together as brothers and sisters. This is God's love in Christ Jesus, which makes them soft and melts away that which previously held them at a distance from one another." So that's the instinct, to trust that we're better together. So how then shall we live? Let's turn to the third instinct. Pietists expect that there's less and more to Christianity than we think. And I'm probably cramming a few too many ideas here together. Just notice, first of all, it's not just what we think, it's what we do. And maybe we try to do too much. Maybe we make Christianity too complicated. I think Pietism does have a kind of simplifying impulse to it. Only the essential doctrines. Focus on some essential practices. Don't make the structure and the process too complicated. I think Pietists tend to be pretty democratic, egalitarian, a little suspicious of church hierarchy and church organization. Again, maybe to a fault. But here, let me especially underline that word more. There are ways to do Christianity that even echo the first two instincts, but don't really expect much change to come out of loving God and loving neighbor. This is certainly true within Protestantism. There's a way of thinking about being saved by grace alone, through faith alone, that doesn't seem to leave much evidence of change. And here, Pietists really thought that they were trying to recover something of Martin Luther's that had been lost as the Reformation lost momentum in the late 16th into the early 17th century. We'll say more about this in part 3, but here's how I put it in our book. Pietists fully expect the encounter with Jesus to be transformative. While Luther was right to expect that saints will always remain to some degree sinners, his Pietist heirs know that the Protestant reformer was onto something when he gushed, "It's a living, busy, active, mighty thing, this faith. It is impossible for it not to be doing good works incessantly." That's from Luther's preface to the book of Romans. So he wants to make clear we're not saved by our works, but because of the gift of faith in God's goodness and graciousness, we are going to be changed from the inside out. Faith is not just a passive reception of grace. Faith is not just intellectual assent to some kind of proposition. It's not just mouthing a creed or a confession. It's a living, busy, active, mighty thing. This is why the Pietists use language like new birth and new life. So much more about that as we continue. But Pietists would expect Christianity to make a tremendous difference in the life of the believer, and maybe in the life of the world. Because the fourth instinct is to hope for better times. And this is hard. The Christian life is not guaranteed to be an easy one. It's not always a happy one. It's certainly not a convenient one. It's a life that doesn't insulate us from crisis and from war, from disease, from tragedy, from despair. But Pietists would say in the midst of all of that, we have every reason to hope for better times. I love how Christian Collins Wynne put this once to me. He said that if we believe in the resurrection, that Jesus can be resurrected, any human can be resurrected. If any individual can be resurrected, the church can be resurrected. And if the church can be resurrected, the world can be resurrected. Pietism sees the possibility of new life everywhere, from any individual to the ends of the world. My favorite articulation of this comes from one of the people we dedicated our book to, Glenn Weiberg. You see pictured here. So Glenn was a longtime covenant pastor, attended Yale Divinity School, served churches around the country, was also a gifted writer, a poet, a hymn writer, and was a mentor for me. He had been retired from his position as pastor of Salem Covenant Church, but stuck around as a pastor emeritus, and I got to be in a book group with him and got to really learn at his feet. So back when Glenn was the pastor of Salem in the 1980s, he had some real personal tragedy. His son Carl, who was a seminary student at North Park, developed multiple sclerosis and died at age 27, leaving behind a young wife. And that summer in 1984, Glenn had to get up in the pulpit in Salem and preach at the funeral of his young son. And he chose to preach on Mark 14, about the anointing of Jesus at Bethany. A woman buys an incredibly expensive jar of ointment called nard. The jar is made out of alabaster. It's this impossibly expensive gift. And she shatters the jar, cracks it open, pours out all of the ointment on Jesus' feet. And some of the disciples think that she has wasted it. They can't believe the wastefulness of this woman. But Jesus says nothing is wasted. And so Glenn used that image. And it's been 3 years now since Glenn died. And I've never been able to get through this. But I'll do my best. Here's what he preached over the body of his son. The good news I want to share with you is that nothing is wasted, neither the precious ointment, nor the alabaster jar, nor its brokenness. But when all is said and done, everything in the long run depends on God's doing, where everything finally serves his purpose, gathering up the fragments in resurrection, so that nothing goes down the drain, nothing at all is lost. I wish you could know Glenn. I honestly think the best way to define pietism would be to spend time with someone like him. But this is a pretty good summation of at least this one pietist instinct, that in the end, nothing, not even brokenness, not even tragedy, is wasted. And God gathers all things up, all the little bits and pieces, all the shards of the broken pottery, gathers them up in resurrection so that nothing is wasted. And that's, I think, what hope for better times can mean. So I remember writing this the first time, getting to the end and thinking, well, who would disagree with this? And maybe that's just because I'm a pietist. That sounds right. It sounds pretty good. I would think most people agree with at least parts of this. But here's the other thing about pietism. Not everyone likes it. Pietism is a movement. It's an ethos. But probably more recently, it's a pejorative. It's a nasty word. You encounter this in a lot of places, including Lutheranism. So let me close with the story of another covenant pastor, Roger Olson. He's a brilliant man, got his PhD in English from the University of Chicago, was a professor and dean there, and then came back to North Park College and Seminary as its president in 1959 and served until 1970. Karl also wrote books, including one about the 7 deadly sins, and one reviewer accused him of being moralistic and pietistic. And so in 1962, Karl used his column in the Lutheran Standard, the magazine of the old ALC, and said this about pietism. A little historical accuracy might restore pietism to its original meaning, in which case I'd be glad to be considered pietistic. I don't expect my reviewer to know that pietism was originally a life movement within the Lutheran Church, and that it involved a meaningful personalization of grace. It is much easier to use an honorable word as a dishonorable handle. And nowadays, I think pietism is an honorable word that's mostly used as a dishonorable handle. If you say someone is a pietist or accuse them of being pietistic, you probably mean that they're moralistic, they're legalistic, or that they're anti-intellectual, or that maybe they're too heavenly minded to be any earthly good. We'll talk about all those things before we're done with this series, but I guess the case I want to make to you is that pietism still can be a life movement within the Lutheran Church and other churches, and it still involves a meaningful personalization of God's grace. Well, thanks for watching part 2 of this 4-part series. Again, here's how you can get in touch with me and read more, and I'll put more links on our YouTube page for this segment. In part 3, we'll do some real history. We'll look at the original movement and then how it intersected with the story of Lutheranism in the 17th century all the way up to the present day. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.